Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. Today we're going to be talking about the procedure shaping that's discussed in Chapter 9. And shaping is used in lots of ways. It's used in classrooms. It's used to train people how to do technical activities like tying your shoes or how to put on a hearing aid. It's been used in a lot of animal behavior settings to train animals to engage in certain behaviors. So let's talk a little bit about shaping, and then I'll send you off to see some videos so that you can get some real clear examples of what shaping is all about. So shaping is basically a procedure in which you reinforce approximations toward a final target behavior. Specifically, these are typically long chains of behavior or a complex behavior that may not manifest itself just automatically. You can't just sit around and wait for an individual to tie their shoes or to use a washing machine. And so we use, instead, we take successive approximations toward that final behavior. So these are behaviors that actually are not, we reinforce behaviors that are not the final behavior that we want, but we do it in a progressive way so that we're always having the individual move forward, either physically or behaviorally, toward that final behavioral goal. This could involve buttoning your shirt or tying your shoes. It could be a more complex behavior like playing in cooperative groups or giving a high five. And there are lots of examples from animal behavior that I have videos of to show you what it basically looks like. Shaping is always used when an individual needs to learn a new behavior. So we don't use shaping to teach a behavior someone already knows or to change its frequency or its probability. Instead, these are behaviors that either the individual doesn't have at all or they have some rudimentary form of the behavior and you'd like them to develop greater mastery over the behavior. It involves teaching a desired behavior or a task by reinforcing what we call successive approximations of the behavior. So we're looking for them to gradually move their behavior closer and closer to the target behavior. When you're using a shaping technique, each approximate desired behavior, each approximation that's demonstrated is reinforced. Behaviors that are not an approximation of the behavior are not reinforced. So it's a little bit like a game of hot and cold. You wait for a closer version of the behavior and then you provide the reinforcer. And as you do that, you stop reinforcing the previous approximation. When one approximation is acquired, you stop reinforcing that response and you make reinforcement contingent on the next approximation. And so success is ultimately achieved by reinforcing each of these successive steps toward that final behavior and then stopping the reinforcement and waiting for the next step toward that behavior until you finally get the behavior that you actually want. Okay, so I'm going to have you pause the lecture at this point and go to the assignments and lecture videos folder to see several examples of shaping. And then you can come back here and we'll go over a detailed explanation of how shaping can be used to train a handshake in a young man with Down syndrome. Okay, so as you can see, there are many times when true shaping can be very beneficial for establishing a new behavior. If successive approximations happen naturally and you have the chance to reinforce each approximation, we tend to take that. We tend to take advantage of that in applied behavior analysis. So when you have children learning to play together, as the approximations from side-by-side play to more cooperative play develop, there's a natural opportunity for teachers to reinforce those behaviors and encourage those behaviors. Often shaping is more deliberate, combined with other techniques to provide, to facilitate rapid behavior change. So I want to give you an example, a therapeutic example, of a young man, 24 years old, named Paul, who has Down syndrome. And in this example, Paul originally had his original greeting method, his current greeting method, was to hug people. And this behavior had developed with teachers and family members, but it began to generalize to strangers and people that he did not know well. And even Paul's family began to feel uncomfortable with the amount of hugging that he was engaging in. So both the school staff and Paul's parents felt that he needed to learn. As he became older, they really felt like he needed more appropriate ways to greet people that could be used across settings and across different people that he perhaps didn't know as well as his immediate family. And so they decided that the target behavior should be handshaking instead of hugging. And so the shaping goal was to shape the outstretching of his right hand, of both hands for a hug. So he would put both hands out for a hug, and they wanted to reduce his left hand being extended and focus on his outstretched right hand for a handshake. So they were going to take this behavior of putting his arms out to ask for a hug and change it into the extension of one arm, not two, to request a handshake. All right. So the first thing that they did was a functional assessment, and they found that Paul exhibited this desired behavior by extending his arms and his hands prior to hugging the other people. And the question was, what is the function of this behavior? Why was he doing this? And the BCBA, who was involved with the project, identified that Paul was looking for the sensory contact of a hug. And she felt that he could be satisfied with other kinds of sensory input instead, and so that he could be seeking physical contact as a sensory issue. So it was decided that the reinforcer should be sensory in nature, that when they thought the target behavior should produce a substitute sensory reinforcer for him. And it needed to be large enough to substitute for a hug. So for them, the reinforcer would ultimately be a tight hand grip and a large pumping action for a handshake. And that would be sensory enough, she hoped, to get him to shift his behavior over. So Paul exhibited this desired behavior of extending his arms, requesting a hug from another person. And so they identified a point in his greeting process when the BCBA would intervene between the other adult and Paul to initiate a hug instead of a handshake instead of a hug. And so what would happen is, as Paul would come up and his arms would begin to rise, the BCBA would hold his left hand down and allow his right arm and his right hand to extend. When Paul demonstrated the handshaking behavior without a hug, the other adult, a second adult, would provide him with a tight handshake with a vigorous shaking motion. And so it took two people, one to hold his left hand back and the other to grab his hand, his right hand as it came up, and shake his hand. So here's the final treatment with physical prompting. Paul extends both arms. Aid number 1 lowers Paul's left hand. Aid number 2 takes his right hand and firmly squeezes and pumps. And they repeat this until Paul shows signs of no longer raising his left hand, and introducing the handshake himself. And so they were using shadow prompting and fading and shaping to get him to shake hands. And then they replaced the physical prompts with verbal prompts, like shake hands with David, Paul, and then he would shake hands. So a good example of the combination of physical prompting and shaping together to create a more acceptable version of a greeting for this individual. Now, following treatment, generalization training is usually very important. And we've talked about this previously. And so generalization training simply means that we go and we train the behavior in other locations with other people. And so they began by training him with familiar adults that he knew, and then they moved to novel adults in a familiar setting, and then they moved to familiar adults in novel settings, and finally generalization training with novel adults in novel settings. And the more they engaged in each of these combinations, the more likely it was that given a novel situation with novel people, that Paul would initiate a handshake rather than a hug. So that's a good example of the use of shaping, prompting, and generalization together. All right, so we'll get together for the next chapter, which is chapter 11 on chaining. So have a good afternoon.